Hello everybody, welcome back to a new vlog. Before I start off and chatter for a long time, I wanted to thank everybody new, everyone who subscribed, everyone who watched the last video, and everyone who left a comment. I did not expect this video to reach a larger audience. It means a lot. I just wanted to thank everyone to begin with. And to explain where I've been, I've not been far. I've been in my room, doing my thing. I've just been in a slump emotionally. I was in a really big slump emotionally the week after I posted. That was just a bad week for me, and I still wanted to give you a little bit of context. And that also led to a kind of book slump. I think I'm still in it a little bit. I've tried to read so many books in February and not a lot of them have stuck. That being said, I think I'm slowly getting out of it. I was on vacation last week. Anyway, to start off the video in a very bookish way, I have a book haul. And I know that I should not be buying more books, especially after I already had a book haul in my last video. And the worst part about this is that I did not plan on buying these books. There's only one that I went in with the purpose of buying it. The rest of them, I just stumbled across a second-hand bookshop and I bought some books. I got 5 books for 35 Canadian dollars, which is not a lot. It's really cheap for this country at least. So yeah, I have a book haul. I genuinely hope that I will stop and I don't want to buy more books and then accumulate them because I don't like having that many books. It kind of stresses me out. And I used to only buy books after having read them. I would only buy books that I knew I loved so much that I would return to. And I kind of stopped doing that, and part of me is fine with it and the other part is like, I shouldn't be buying this many books. But anyway, I'm actually gonna start with the one book that I got for free. I was talking to my professor, something that I never do. I was talking to her about one of my essays and we got to talking about literature, and she was telling me about a Joan Didion book called Let Me Tell You What I Mean. She told me she had extra copies and that she could bring it for me the next class. I thought she would forget, but she didn't. I thought she would lend it to me, but she genuinely gave it to me, so that's really cool and exciting. This is an essay collection. It says 12 pieces that offer an illuminating glimpse into the mind and process of a legendary figure. I really want to read her works, and I also really want to watch the Netflix documentary she has. I think I want to start with the Netflix documentary before I get into it. The book that I went in with the purpose of buying is Brutes by Diz Tate. I really love the cover. I put it on my want to reads on Goodreads, and I was like, let me go to the bookstore and see if it's there. Why not? It was there. So I got it. I don't know if I'm gonna love this. I feel like I shouldn't annotate it right away because if I don't love it, I probably won't want to keep it, but I also think that I would like it. It's kind of this weird feeling where I love the cover so much and the story sounds really appealing, but I don't know if the execution is going to work for me. But this is what it says on the back. A coming-of-age story about the crucible of girlhood from a writer of rare and startling talent. And there's a quote: "We would not be born out of sweetness. We were born out of rage. We felt it in our bones." This sounds fun, doesn't it? I think it does. I hopefully will love it. This is a book that I talked about in my last video. Annie John by Jamaica Kincaid. This was one of the books I did not expect to find at the secondhand bookshop. It was there. I was so happy to have found it. There were 2 of them. I'm not going to be reading this right away, but I hopefully will get into it in March. Either way, it's a book that really intrigues me. Next, I got Zadie Smith's N.W. I was shocked at the condition of these books, honestly. Sometimes I want to get really worn out books when I go to, secondhand bookshop, but all of these were really good condition. This is a book that I don't think I would jump into if it weren't mentioned several times in Open Water by Caleb Azuma Nelson, which I reread. We're going to talk about all the books I read in February at the end of this video, by the way, but he mentions the book several times in Open Water, and I love Open Water so much that when I saw it, I knew it was a sign and I had to get it. The only thing that bothers me with Zadie Smith, and it's a really petty thing, I don't love the covers. This is a story about class, race. It's set in London. It talks about ambition. It talks about social location. It says a portrait of modern urban life. NW is funny, sad, and urgent, as brimming with vitality as the city itself. Very keen to get to it in the upcoming months. This is the only worn out book that I found. It's The Pearl by John Steinbeck. It says he won a Nobel Prize, something which I didn't know. I have not read any of his works. I just got this one because it was the most worn out one, and also because I'd heard about it recently in one of Melissa's videos, and it's really short, so I hope I'll get to it pretty soon. And then there were 2 NYRBs that I got, one of them being A High Wind in Jamaica by Richard Hughes. The story sounded fun. It says it's funny in the back, which is something that's pretty rare for me. It does take place in Jamaica on a plantation. It says the narrative begins among the decayed plantation houses, an overwhelming natural abundance of late 19th century Jamaica. But I found out that it was written by a white author after I bought it, so I'm a little bit more closed off, I guess. And then I just got this one because it was a Russian author and the cover is cool. It's Pushkin's Peter the Great's African Experiments in Prose. I really hope this is good. I think it'll be a nice entryway into Russian literature because I still not tried to read any Russian literature. Anyway, that was my book haul. A quick update before the sun sets. I did my midterm and it went okay, I think. I'm never entirely sure, but I think this one went pretty okay. The questions weren't too hard, and the comfort of doing it whenever I wanted in my own house is just the best. But I'm going to be starting a new book for this week. It is quite short, so maybe I'll have time to start another. I have 2 books I would like to get to this week. The first one that I'm starting right now is Little Rot by Akwaeke Emezi. I've heard it was a kind of thrilling book, but it still has some dark aspects. I'm not entirely sure. I hope it will stick. Apart from the books I've read, this is the 9th book that I'm starting this month, 8 of which I haven't finished. So I really hope that this one will work for me. And the second book that I want to read this week is Passing by Nella Larson. That's a classic, but yeah, those are the books that I hopefully will get to this week. I don't think I will talk about them that much if I do a wrap up, but I still wanted to give you an update of how this afternoon has been going. I'm gonna try to read for like an hour-ish, see if I can really get into the book. I really hope, crossing my own fingers. Hello. As February is coming to an end, I wanted to share books that I want to get to in the month of March. Unlike last month, my TBR is a lot shorter. I realized that I put too much in the last one, and I also really didn't get to most of the books that I talked about already. I think that was partly because of the reading slump, but all the books I've mentioned before are still books that I want to read. That being said, here is my very short March TBR. The first book that is on my TBR is Minor Detail by Adanya Shibley. This is a book that I will be getting to this year. It's a dark book in the topics that it talks about. It covers violence. It's a story about Palestine, and it's definitely going to be a difficult read. And then I have a complete 180 because the next book is actually a really funny, positive, uplifting story. It's Greta and Veldin by Rebecca K. Riley. Oud just read it and she absolutely loved it, gave it 5 stars. So I want to read it. I know that it covers the LGBTQ experience in a fun way that's not depressing, because a lot of the time, due to the violence that surrounds these relationships, they can be really hard and sad. But this one is just uplifting, it's fun, and everyone who I've heard talk about the book has just said it was really funny. As much as I love to read my dark and sad books, I also need something to get me out of that sometimes because it can really get you into just a difficult, sad state. The next book is called A Language of Limbs by Dylan Hardcastle. I only very recently heard about this book, I think 2 days ago. I watched a video by Grandpa's Book Club. He was recommending some LGBTQ stories for Mardi Gras, and the urgency in his voice when talking about this specific story really convinced me. It talks about desire, it talks about first love, coming of age. It's a story that drew me in without even having started to read it. Up next is the book Queer by William S. Burroughs. It's been adapted to the screen by Luca Guadagnino, who directed Call Me By Your Name, Challengers. He's a brilliant director. I just watched a video about him, about the movies that impacted him, and I really want to watch the movie, so I want to read the book because of that. I think that's it for my TBR. I haven't put a French book in there yet. I will maybe read one. If I don't, it's okay, but I don't want to stress myself out and make it really long. And I also want to make a spring TBR in a little bit, so I'll film that at some point later in the month. So there's a lot of books that I want to read in the upcoming months. Just like always, there's always new books that I want to read, and my feelings towards what I will read change a lot. We'll see what I'll end up reading. But yeah, I'm still not fully out of the rut. Made a drawing with my lip liner. I actually really like the result, especially the face. Not a fan of the chest, but I made it with my lip liner because I don't have any pencil. So I'm hoping to find actually pastels tomorrow instead of colored pencils or anything. I just hung it up on my wall and my room has been so bare, but hopefully I'll start making more of these. Just like really easy. This took me like 5 minutes, but it was fun and I kind of like the result of it in my room. This is where I put it right now and I like it. February is finally over. Today is the 1st of March. It's Saturday. I am very relieved to be done with February. Most of February felt very sad and it felt very static. The city itself was dull for a lot of the time because of the snowstorm, and it just felt like it was not a real month. And even though it's the shortest month of the year, it definitely went by extremely slowly. So I'm just happy to put it behind me, get into warmer weather. But despite it being a bad month, I read some pretty interesting books. But I will say, when I was writing a little bit of how I felt about them, I realized that a lot of the books that I read last month were very violent. Most of them were talking about violence, and thinking back, that might have impacted my mood as well, because covering violence back to back, it feels very hopeless. I ended up reading 5 books last month. The first one was Just Kids by Patti Smith. I've talked extensively about it in my last video, but for those of you who don't want to see that, I'll give you a very, very quick consensus. I found it very, very moving as a whole piece. I loved being a part of her and Robert's life, especially amidst the New York City art scene backdrop. It was my favorite book of last month. After that first week of February, that's when my rut really began, and I couldn't pick up a book. So I decided to reread a book that I love, a book that I love returning to. It was my 3rd time reading it overall. It's Open Water by Caleb Zuma Nelson. I mentioned it earlier, but I think this is one of my favorite books ever. It manages to be a different reading experience every time I dive into it. To use Caleb's own words within the book, it kind of talks about the conditions under which unconditional love breaks. It is a very political contemporary read. The first time I read it, it was in 2021. What had struck me the most was the love story, the tenderness and the honesty in which it was written. It felt very plausible while still being romantic. Of course, I was aware of the other themes, particularly the racism, because that drives the narrative. But what made me fall in love with the story was the love story. And then the second time I read it, which was in 2023, that's when I realized how much it talks about racism, specifically racial profiling, and the way that socio-political contexts not only impact our daily lives but bleed into our relationships with others. How trauma and anger have repercussions on how we treat others and how we treat ourselves, how we define others and how we define ourselves. And what I think is beautiful is that he really demonstrates how you cannot extricate your social position from the love that you give to others if that love is honest. And then this time, what struck me was, of course, these other very important part of the stories, and it is Black art in general. So whether it be dancing, music, photography, writing, it's really an ode to Black art made by Black people, that center Black people, for Black people, the Black space, specifically within London. And what continues to move me every time is also his writing. I think it's one of the most beautiful pieces I've ever read, and I know that it can come off as maybe a little pretentious for some people because it's very lyrical, there's a lot of repetition, it's written in the second person, which does not work for everyone, but I genuinely believe that everyone should read this book. After that, I read Incendie by Weshdi Mouawad. It's called Scorched. This is a play, and I hadn't read a play since I was in middle school when I had to for school. In the French school, we read a lot of plays, they make us write them and everything. I don't know if that's as common in other places, but I hadn't read a play in a long time. I've been kind of watching them more, especially when I'm back in France, and so it's just not been an appeal to me. And then I read this one because there's a French YouTuber who I really like who started a book club, and that was the first book in the book club, and I wanted to watch the replay of the live. So I read the book. It's very short, and it reignited my love for theater because theater is so alive as a genre. It comes out of the page more than a lot of other stories because there's no description. It's 90% dialogue, and yet you can still see the setting, which I think is incredible. It submerges you very well, but this was still a shocking and sad and gruesome story that explores violence very deeply. It's about two siblings whose mother just died, and her will asks them to give a letter to their father and their brother that they didn't know existed, and they're both very angry at her because she had stopped speaking for the last few years of her life. Silence is a big theme in this book. It's obviously a reflection of how the mother acts or doesn't act. It impacts how the characters grieve her existence because they feel almost like she died already through her silence. My conclusion about the silence is that it is also a reflection of how the world can be silent in the face of brutality, war, horror. It just demonstrates how a lot of people turn away from the harsh truth and close their eyes. And I think that's insanely pertinent to the world right now. Then I read Petit Pays, which has been translated as well. It's called Small Country in English. This was my least favorite book of the month, not because of the story itself. I thought the story was very good. I'm going to talk about it in a second. But what didn't work for me was the writing. It put me out of the story instead of hooking me in. But it is essentially a story of a childhood in Burundi. The protagonist is a small boy, and we follow his life then, specifically how his life turns around when the genocide and the war starts in that region of the world. It covers a lot of violence again, but because it's written in the point of view of a child, you're almost shielded from it while still having the brutal honesty of a child. I learned a lot about Burundi specifically. It was not a country of which the history I knew a lot about. I knew a lot about Rwanda because of the genocide that took place there, and our main character is half French, half Rwandan. It's very close to the author's own life. He grew up in Burundi, he's half Rwandan, half French, and so you just know that it's written in a honest, authentic way. And then finally, I end this month with Little Rot. As you know, very difficult book because the main characters are extremely flawed, extremely morally gray. The work itself explores wrongdoing, violence, morality, darkness, and power dynamics. It takes place in Nigeria. We follow a group of people who are all interconnected, and the story opens with a extremely shocking and brutal scene that changes one of those characters. I found the story overall extremely interesting, but it was constantly hard to read because of how genuinely dark it is. Personally, I was also a little bit put off by the amount of sexual scenes, specifically in the first half. I think almost every chapter had one, but they all comment about power dynamics or just lust as a consequence of one's own processing of emotions. And then I think the second half of the story really picks up in pace, and that's when I was more engrossed in it. But I will say it is extremely gruesome, extremely shocking, and I'm someone who's not very triggered by triggering things in books, but if you are, I don't think it's gonna work for you, and if you can't follow extremely flawed characters, it's not gonna work either. It was definitely, for me, the hardest book to read of the month in terms of the content, and as you can tell, I read a lot of difficult books. I think I'm going to read a happier book to start March off because I just can't be drained. Let me know what your favorite book of February was, if you have one, and I think I won't speak anymore in this vlog, so thank you for tuning in to the last week of February with me.